Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome to Talking Tudors, episode 181. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the wonderful listeners who continue to support my podcast on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors patron family. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll have access to patron-only monthly giveaways. November's prize is a copy of Adrian Dillard's latest novel, Keeper of the Queen's Jewels, a novel of Jane Seymour. Thank you to the author for sponsoring this wonderful prize. All patrons are also eligible to attend monthly Talking Tudors live talks, which take place on Zoom. This weekend, I'll be chatting to Philippa Lacey-Bruhl from British History Tours about Tudor historic sites. Please check Patreon for all the details. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I'd love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm excited that joining me on the show to discuss Anne Boleyn's Ladies-in-Waiting is Sylvia Barbara Soberton. Sylvia is a writer, historian, and researcher specializing in the history of the Tudors. She debuted in 2015 with her best-selling book, The Forgotten Tudor Women, Mary Howard, Mary Shelton, and Margaret Douglas. Sylvia's other bestsellers include Golden Age Ladies, Women Who Shaped the Courts of Henry VIII and Francis I, Great Ladies, The Forgotten Witnesses to the Lives of the Tudor Queens, The Forgotten Tudor Women, Anne Seymour, Jane Dudley, and Elizabeth Parr, and others. Our conversation is coming straight up after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Sylvia. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, it's so lovely to talk to you. So let's start with an introduction. If you could just introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
So my name is Sylvia Barbara Soberton. I'm an author, historian, researcher specializing in the Tudor period. I wrote several books about the Tudors, especially about the Tudor women. My debut series of books was The Forgotten Tudor Women. There are 3 volumes in that series. My most recent one is about Anne Boleyn's Ladies-in-Waiting. I wrote also about medical downfall of the Tudors and Golden Age ladies. So I'm concentrating mostly on women.
Fantastic. And we are actually here to talk about your latest book, which is very exciting. So Ladies-in-Waiting, Women Who Served Anne Boleyn. So why did you feel that you wanted to really narrow in and focus on this particular subject?
Well, The aspects of Anne Boleyn's life and death are fiercely debated by historians, but we usually tend to concentrate on her relationships with men. So with Henry VIII, with her suitors, with her brother, father, with the putative lovers who were executed on 17 May of 1536. And her ladies-in-waiting remain kind of an understudied area. So I wanted to concentrate on that because I knew there is a lot of material to explore, and that Anne's story may sound a little bit different when you look at it through the eyes of women. So that was my focus because I primarily work on women's lives. So I was very excited to explore this avenue of research.
Excellent. Yes, I think it's always good when you sort of look at these well-known stories through a different lens. I think so
Exactly. Yes.
that's wonderful. So before we actually dive in to look more specifically at Anne Boleyn's ladies in waitings, could you tell us a little bit just about a lady in waiting and how does this happen in the 16th century? How do you become one?
Well, so women started their careers as maids of honor. So they were unmarried, usually in their teens, daughters of aristocrats. Usually their fathers, brothers, grandfathers even served at court already. So they were introduced by family connections, like it was, for example, the case with Mary Howard, Anne Boleyn's first cousin. She started serving Anne when she was actually 12, so very, very young. So usually the Queen and her Lord Chancellor picked the ladies. The king sometimes interfered also, whether he would do this on his own volition or whether he was asked to be consulted, And physical appearance played a major part in selecting the ladies because they not only serve, but they were like kind of a decorative ornaments to court. So first thing you saw were the ladies of the queen, and they had to look presentable. So yes, good looks was very important. I would say that's like the first thing, the first criteria that a woman was judged.
And in terms of some of the other skills that these women were, hopefully should possess at the time, can you talk to us a little bit about those particular skills?
Well, so among the basic skills, of course, reading and writing, sewing, embroidering, because that's what the women did behind closed doors. Also, singing, dancing, playing on instruments. For example, Henry VIII's first recorded mistress, Bessie Blount, who served as Catherine of Aragon's maid of honor, was said to have, excelled all other women in singing, dancing, and in all pastimes. And Henry VIII, he fancied himself a little bit of a musician, poet, and he paid attention to women with similar skills. Also, when you think about Anne Boleyn, she was said to have had a good singing voice and accompany herself on the lute and on other instruments as well. Also, because they would sing to the queen also, reading, singing to her, all sorts of stuff. And also the language was very important. So the cultured people at court spoke French. And it was very important when during occasions of state when women would talk to foreign ambassadors, so usually in French. Anne Boleyn spoke very good French. She was excellent, and just in general terms, French was very, very important. So good looks, education, a bit of domestic skills, a mix, a little bit.
Yes, yeah, they were very talented women, weren't they? It's incredible the things they could do.
They had to do everything. I tend to think about them as the silent witnesses to the lives of Tudor queens, but they were not so silent, because they had to, they observed, from the sidelines, but they also some of them were powerful players. So
absolutely, yes.
Interesting, yeah.
Definitely. So we've talked a little bit about the skills required, but can you tell us a little bit more about maybe like what did a day in the life kind of involve, and what duties are they there to specifically perform? You've touched on a couple, but maybe we can go into this a little bit deeper.
Okay, so when it comes to the groups of servants in the Queen's privy chamber, we would have chamberers, ladies in waiting, and maids of honor. So chamberers did this kind of menial tasks like emptying chamber pots in the morning, or plumping the pillows, preparing the bed for the night, sweeping the chamber so they were clean and refreshed. And then ladies in waiting and maids of honor came more into a very personal contact with the queen. And that was very prestigious post, more so than a chamberer. Chamberer was more of a, menial servant, but close to the queen as well. So ladies in waiting had all sorts of duties. First, when the queen woke up, they had to dress her. They had to comb her hair, prepare her for the day. They served her during the meals. For example, there was this ceremonial role of carver, the queen's carver. So she carved her meat and gave her on a platter so that she chose whatever she wanted. What else? Well, they would read to her. They would accompany her wherever she went. So, for example, if the queen goes to the chapel, even if she's going to her own private chapel, then she's accompanied by women. So she's never alone, basically. Even at night, there is a pallet bed reserved for a lady in waiting, the queen's so-called bedfellow, so that she would sleep with her and tend to her every beck and call, even at night. So it was not a solitary existence. Privacy was a rare commodity. Later in Elizabeth's reign, Elizabeth would complain that 1,000 eyes see what I do. And also, thinking about the accusations of Anne Boleyn, adultery and all that, how could she have committed those if she was surrounded by women on a daily basis, every hour of her day, never alone?
Yeah, it is amazing, isn't it, with our notion of privacy and how special that is
Oh, yeah.
to us, to think
Yes.
of being in contact with someone the whole, 24 hours a day is quite awful to me. I love spending time alone. So.
Yeah, and even in your own bedchamber, you can't be alone.
No, it is. Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it? So let's focus on Anne Boleyn for the rest of the conversation. So can you tell us about some of the ladies who became close to Anne as her star is sort of rising, in the late 1520s and the early 30s? Who are those women that kind of stand out or stood out to you in your research?
Okay, so in July of 1531, Anne Boleyn was under impression that she would be married to the king within 3 or maybe 4 months. And so she started appointing her royal household. And before that, we don't really have any good indication of who served her. But after 1531, it becomes very, very, very clear who served her. So in 1531, 32, during that festive season, Catherine of Aragon was not at court because she was banished. She still had her own royal household with about 50 maids of honor serving her, but it was remarked that Anne Boleyn had her own ladies in waiting and that she was served by almost as many ladies as if she were queen. And the first hint of Anne's elevated status is in the list of New Year's gifts in 1531, when Henry VIII gave gifts to 5 ladies who were said to have been with the Lady Anne. And I assume these ladies were very close to her because some of them went on to transfer to her royal household. And so these ladies were Anne Savage, Anne Jocelyn, Marjorie Horseman, Jane Ashley, and Risley. I only couldn't identify the Risley girl, and the others are well known and they do appear in Anne's later story. So Savage, Jocelyn, Horseman, and Ashley, they would serve Anne when she became queen. So for example, Anne Savage, she was present during Anne's secret wedding to the king on 25th of January 1533. So I assume they would have been very close. But sadly for us, Anne Savage married. She married in April of 1533. She was present during Anne's coronation, but she withdrew from court later. So we don't hear about her all that much later on. So, that was also the path of many women who first served at court as young women, and then when they married, they went on to raise their own children, run their own households, be great ladies of their own homes. So when Anne Boleyn was selecting the women who would serve her, she was influenced by close relationships that she had with them. So in the first place, she would have been served by women of her own family. So we have Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford. Anne Boleyn's mother sometimes appeared as Anne's lady / chaperone, but I wouldn't expect her to have served her daughter as a lady in waiting, as like we think about other women who would serve Anne daily. So more of a ceremonial role. Then Mary Carey, Anne Boleyn's sister, Elizabeth Somerset, Countess of Worcester. She would play a role later on when Anne would be arrested. Mary Howard was also very prominent in Anne's story before Anne became queen. So you can actually trace Mary Howard's role as Anne's first maid of honor and then lady in waiting from the very early on. For example, she appears first at court in 1532 when Anne is elevated to the status of Marchioness of Pembroke, and Mary Howard is only 12, so very, very young. And later on, after Anne's death, Mary Howard was the informant of John Fox, who said that she was chief of the maids of honor at Anne's court in her household, and she was his informant, so she was in a position to know a lot of things about Anne and her habit, her faith, just a domestic life at court and in the household. And also, I would say that Marjorie Horseman was also very close to Anne before Anne became queen, and later on also after Anne became queen in 1533. Marjorie is this kind of woman who appears all the time in the court record. She was approached also by, for example, Honor Lyle, who wanted to place her two daughters at court in Anne's household. And so I would think that Marjorie Horseman, that she was very, very close to Anne, because again, there's evidence from later on that when there were these investigations and questionings during Anne's downfall, that Marjorie didn't really want to say much because there was this great friendship between her and Anne. So I think they were very close, and also just because other people approached her on a daily basis, so they had to know that she was close to the queen.
Yeah, it's very interesting also to note that you've pointed out those familial ties and how important they were, because we do see this repeated, don't we, through all the sort of queens that we look at. Elizabeth of York did the same thing, surrounded herself with family. We see Elizabeth do it later on, of course, with her Boleyn relatives. And it must have given them a sense of, security, perhaps, that perhaps you can trust these people a little more. I don't know.
Yes, and also, Anne, if she were a foreign princess, she would have come with her own household and all sorts of people, but she was English, so she didn't have foreign connections, and so she had to surround herself with her own people. Yes, I think she would have thought that they were not very likely to betray her, so she had that security in being surrounded by family. But as you know, it's not always didn't always go as planned. Relatives banished here and there, so
yeah, exactly.
I'm thinking about her sister-in-law.
Absolutely. So they're all very complex relationships, aren't they? Especially when you're having a relationship with the queen. It's a very kind of complicated situation, isn't it? So you've mentioned that 4 of the women that obviously served Anne in the earlier days then go on to serve her in her royal household. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of those women or the other women that were appointed when she becomes queen in 1533?
Well, so out of the 31 women who appear on the coronation list in 1533, 16 were related to Anne by blood or by marriage to the male members of her family. So we have, for example, Jane Boleyn, Anne's sister-in-law, Mary Carey, her sister, Mary Howard, of course, Mary Shelton, and here Mary Shelton served her as maid of honor because she was unmarried and young, probably in her early 20s. And, Mary Shelton is somebody who also appears quite often in accounts of Anne's life. She was contributing a lot to the Devonshire manuscript, so she was a poet. She was also briefly Henry VIII's mistress. And there's this view among historians that perhaps Anne introduced Mary Shelton to Henry VIII's bed, somewhat, gave her permission to become the mistress because she was trustworthy and member of the family. But I found no evidence that was the case. I think because there is this account of how Anne's chaplain, William Latimer, said that Anne rebuked Mary Shelton for scribbling, idle poesies in her prayer book. So I don't think that she would have been like, oh yes, go on and be mistress of the king. I give you my permission. No, I don't think that was the case, because Anne's security depended on her relationship with the king. She had to have that close, intimate relationship with him. So not only, intellectually connecting, but also, intimately connecting. So if a woman supplants her in bed of the king, then she's supplanted. And that really happened, so she was right to be suspicious about other women, and she was right to kind of guard her place so fiercely as she did. So when it comes to maids of honor, there were 6 maids in Anne's household. So there was Mary Zouche, Marjorie Horseman, Mary Shelton, Margaret Gamage, Elizabeth Holland, and Jane Ashley. And many of these women would marry at some point and become ladies in waiting, but most of them were unmarried as maid. And so, for example, Marjorie Horseman, she would marry in January of 1537 and become lady in waiting, but to another queen, so to Jane Seymour. Yeah, and it's really interesting to me to think about that many of those women would have been still alive and around when Elizabeth became queen. I think that's not something that is talked very often because we concentrate on Elizabeth's memories of Anne and how she perhaps didn't have a lot of them, but there were people at court who remembered Anne. So that's really kind of fascinating to think about that, if she wanted to, she could have approached someone and asked about her mother. And I'm wondering if that was something that the ladies in waiting of her mother would, be like, oh, I remember your mother doing this or that. Or would they be just, like Anne Boleyn doesn't exist because she was executed? Interesting to ponder.
It is
all
very
those
interesting to
questions.
ponder. I totally agree with you. I think
Yeah.
she had access to lots of sources of information about her mother. And although we don't have it recorded that she inquired, my gut feeling says she definitely did, but privately, obviously. Yeah. And it's very interesting what you were saying about Anne Boleyn and, of course, her need to maintain that intimacy and closeness with the king. And it just reminded me of something that the wonderful late Professor Eric Ives said when he was talking about Anne transitioning from obviously Henry's mistress to his queen, that she was in that very awkward and very difficult position of having to behave like his wife and a queen, but having to, and these are Eric Ives' words, having to continue to challenge like a mistress. So I think that was a very difficult road to travel and to manage, really, wasn't it?
Yes, that was definitely very, very difficult for her. Yeah, because she had that, she had to guard that personal relationship, and there were a lot of women at court who were beautiful, talented as well. And so just imagine having to watch Henry dallying with those women. There's this very interesting account. I'm sure you've read that when Anne was seated beside the French Admiral Gontier, she was like watching the king who was supposed to introduce someone to this admiral, and he started to dally with this lady, and she's like burst into this fit of laughter, and the admiral, are you laughing at me, madam? So
yes, and almost caused a
that. Almost.
diplomatic nightmare, didn't it?
Yeah.
When she was, in fact, she was
Yes.
just
So it
nervously
just
laughing at the
shows you
king.
how frayed her nerves must have been.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
wasn't very, very easy role to be queen, to be Anne Boleyn, because she set a precedent, former maid of honor of the queens. So
let's talk a little bit more about her relationship with these women. When you were doing your research, did you find any sort of interesting bits of information to do with how she treated her women or what the relationship was like?
So I feel like Anne Boleyn was a good mistress to have to serve because she lent books and money to her ladies in waiting. She took care also of their spiritual needs by, of course, encouraging them to read the Bible in English. She had that Bible in her own privy chamber, laid out on a desk. She tried to keep a high moral standard among her women as well. And also, when she was arrested in the beginning of May of 1536, she said that the Countess of Worcester's baby didn't move in her belly. So that's an indication of how close she was with her ladies, talking about these very private matters like pregnancy. And, interestingly, the Countess of Worcester would be the one who was said to have been Anne Boleyn's first accuser. So perhaps in a knowing a lot of secrets, private matters that Anne talked about behind the closed doors. And also when Anne lost her own child when she miscarried in January of 1536, there's this account how her ladies in waiting, they wept because they were so heartbroken for her. And it was Anne Boleyn actually who consoled them, saying that, she would have another child soon. And, the most heartbreaking thing about it was that she never had another baby because she was obviously executed in May 1536. But I feel like it gives us a little bit of a window into her relationships with other women, because we tend to think, I think, and Annie's tend to be portrayed as this, kind of a jealous, maybe bitter, as we've said before, because she was jealous, but she had genuine friendships with the women of her household. And I think she would have been very, very surprised to know that some women perhaps testified against her, or that Cromwell would want to portray her household as, the ladies in waiting, who would step forward with damning accusations. Because, Cromwell would obviously want to give credence to the charges he was preparing against Anne. So if he said that her ladies in waiting stepped forward with the damning accusations, and that makes Anne look really bad, and make, her ladies look, like, oh, we couldn't hide this anymore, so we had to say something. So yes, that's very interesting to think about when you shift the perspective and look at her story, maybe going backward.
Yes, it's such a fascinating time, isn't it? And you mentioned earlier, when you were talking about one of the ladies, that they went then on to serve in Jane Seymour's household. This was, of course, very common, another common thing that occurred, to go from one household to the next. So did many of these women that served Anne then go on to serve her successor, Jane Seymour?
Yes, a lot of them, almost all of them.
Yeah.
So to me, the most interesting thing about it is that when Anne Boleyn's household was disbanded, these women were not sent home, but this shadow household kind of awaited the new mistress. And it was such a fast, smooth transition. But some women didn't go on to Jane's service. So, for example, we have Mary Shelton, who left court, whether of her own volition or whether maybe Jane didn't want to have her in her household. Because, Mary Shelton, she's not only lost the royal mistress that she served, but also Henry Norris, her fiance. So he was beheaded. So that was very tough for her too. And Mary Howard, she didn't serve Jane. We may assume it was because her husband, Henry Fitzroy, died in July of 1536. So she was grieving not only for Anne, but also for her husband. But other women, they went on because, they didn't have any other choice. What choice did they have? The career of maid of honor or lady in waiting was the only thing that these women had, as career path. So they were not really in a position to just switch the royal mistress, because there was no other royal mistress. So, for example, Anne Boleyn's very close friend, Marjorie Horseman, she goes on to become Jane's servant, and she marries in January of 1537. And she and her husband, Michael Lister, they become keepers of the Queen's jewels and money. So that was a very prestigious post to have that in their custody. Also, Marjorie appeared as a recipient of gifts from Jane. So I think that was not necessarily because she betrayed Anne, but because just Marjorie perhaps was this very gentle, friendly person whom you would like to have around, very trustworthy perhaps. Also, Jane Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, she also was in Jane Seymour's new household. She would, again, it's sometimes thought that she betrayed Anne, which is not, not the case. That myth is a lot of work has been done to dispel that myth.
Still hard to extinguish that one, isn't it? It keeps popping up continuously.
I'm not sure. You know what? That's really crazy when you think about it, because there is no evidence that she betrayed them, and the myth is so huge that it overshadows the woman who was said to have been Anne Boleyn's first accuser, so Countess of Worcester. So that's very interesting to me. The Countess of Worcester is almost like she's not playing a role in Anne's downfall whatsoever. But just in general terms, I think that the women didn't have any choice. They had to do what they had to do. I think they, just serving another queen, moving on, not talking a lot about it. That must have been a very tense situation, because the queen was just executed. So, but I think they didn't know what Anne Boleyn's story would end like, because we have the benefit of hindsight. So to us, it's always the case when Anne Boleyn would be executed. And we judge maybe these people, like, judging Jane Seymour for being the king's mistress at the time when Anne was imprisoned. But I think that because it was unprecedented to execute the queen, people just couldn't expect that was what would happen. And, imagine the queen is executed and Jane Seymour is the new queen. So imagine being Jane Seymour at that situation, in that situation. I think it was horrible. And Jane was also, she served Anne as maid of honor. So it's not like these women were strangers to her. They were her colleagues. So that must have been so awkward.
Yes, I think
Oh,
you're right.
I really can't imagine. It really gives me kind of goosebumps when I think about it, because I mean, most of Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting, they went on to become Jane's servants. So she was colleague with those women. They were her maybe friends, maybe just serving, and then the next day Jane is queen. So what do you know? That's crazy. But I think like her position was even more insecure than Anne's, because she really had to get pregnant fast and with a boy. Also, the Countess of Worcester, of whom we spoke earlier, she also went on to serve Jane. And also there's this interesting letter that she wrote to Cromwell, because towards the end of her life, Anne Boleyn lent some money to the Countess. It was £100, which is a huge amount of money for that period. And what's interesting about it is that the husband of the Countess didn't know that she borrowed the money, and he didn't know what she spent the money on. We also don't know what she spent on. But she wrote to Cromwell that Anne would have been a good mistress to her had she been alive, which is a little bit, strange when you think about it, because she was said to have been her first accuser. But I think my view is that these women, if they testify, they just testified whatever came to their minds without, having this malicious intent. And Cromwell, he had to just give color and texture to his accusations. So if he said that ladies in waiting accused her, then, it gains credibility instantly. But they didn't have any choice. So.
Of course. And I think the fact that we have no ladies that are arrested alongside her is very, very strong evidence that they weren't arrested, because there was no crime. Yes. But it's so interesting. And thank you so much. It was so interesting to hear about all the ladies in waiting and the duties and the role. So before I can let you go, though, Sylvia, I have to play our little game of 10 to go. So 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, what was the last book that you either bought or read?
So right now I'm reading Nathan Amin's Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders.
Yes.
That's very interesting. I wanted to read this book for a long time. So now when I'm in between projects, I finally have time to delve into it.
Wonderful.
So that's interesting. Yes. Oh, I have a bunch of unread books on my Kindle, because I usually buy ebooks. But with this one, I bought a physical copy, because I like to buy a physical copy from time to time, although I'm running out of shelf space. The next book I'm going to read, I know, is Catherine Warner's Sex and Sexuality in Medieval England. That's very interesting. Yes. I have pre-ordered a bunch of books too, including yours.
Oh, thank you.
Lots of books coming.
And every time I do an interview, I end up adding more books to my list. So.
Oh, yes.
So what is a favorite historic site or a house that you really love visiting?
So when it comes to the Tudors, I really love Hampton Court Palace. I think it's such a time capsule. So whenever I'm in the UK, I always visit Hampton Court Palace. There will never be a day that I will not visit. Because it just gives me this sense of being there and seeing, within my imagination, of course, these people, Anne Boleyn, Henry, Jane Seymour. So to me, Hampton Court is really a time capsule, and I love it. I love that place.
Yeah, me too. I'm totally the same as you. I go every time I'm there. So when you were a child, Sylvia, what did you dream of becoming when you were older?
Believe it or not, but I was dreaming of being a writer. So
oh, that's good, isn't it? So your dream came true.
Yes. And my teachers usually, they told me that you should be a writer. But as a child, you don't really have that clear idea, you don't know that that's a viable career path, or you don't know what are you going to be writing about. But I know that I was writing, just in my journals, whatever. I was writing soap opera episodes. Oh my God, all sorts of things. So, with the Tudors having something to write about, that's very exciting. So I'm happy that I'm a writer, that the child Sylvia would have been very proud, I think.
That's lovely. That's really lovely. And what would be an ideal Sunday morning for you?
Well, because I have small children, so during Sundays it's a family day. So we
Lovely.
go out to the park when it's a nice weather for it. Just a family day. We hang out together, go out somewhere, just having fun times together.
That sounds lovely. That sounds perfect. So, what about a dream vacation destination? Somewhere you've always really wanted to go, maybe you haven't visited yet, or you have perhaps?
For me, a perfect vacation is always when it's connected to history. So it would be perfect if it's connected to the Tudor history because I live in Slovenia. So for me to plan vacation, I would plan we go to the UK to visit. But with small children, it's not as easy to plan those
Yeah.
things. But I'm hoping that soon, maybe next year, we will start planning. Also, I would like to visit Hawaii because I've never been there, and it's such a beautiful place. So Hawaii, I would say.
Yes, it is beautiful, and the people are so beautiful and so friendly.
Oh,
It's a
have you been
lovely,
there?
lovely place.
Oh.
So keep it on your list. Keep it on your list.
Okay.
So what's a film, either like a period film that you've really enjoyed, or even a series that you've watched? It doesn't have to be a period film, but that you've watched recently.
Oh, recently. Well, one of my all-time favorite period movies would be The Anonymous about, William Shakespeare not being William Shakespeare.
Yes.
I know it's horribly inaccurate. I know it's horribly inaccurate, and I don't really believe that the Earl of Oxford was, writing Shakespeare's plays, but it's such a beautiful, well-made movie. It's so beautiful. The sets are beautiful, the costumes, the actors are excellent. So I would always recommend that just because you can immerse yourself in that period. So yeah, and the period piece that I've been watching recently, well, it's not really period piece, it's a fantasy. It's House of the Dragon. I'm a
Oh,
massive
yes,
fan.
me too.
It was, it's so well made,
It's,
and I feel like I'm watching like a medieval
yeah.
drama. So that was very nice. That was something I watched recently.
Yes, I actually have been watching the same and quite
Oh,
enjoying it.
great.
I am enjoying it, which is good. And interesting that you
Yeah, me
mentioned
too.
Anonymous. On my Patreon, I do a film review with the wonderful,
Oh,
my lovely buddy, Dr. Owen Emerson.
mhm.
And we're thinking that that might actually be the next film we
Oh,
review because we
do
thought,
it.
because it is beautifully made.
Do it.
So
Oh, it's so
I
beautiful.
think that'll be the next one. And now that you've said it, it must be a sign from the universe that
It
that's the
must be
one
a
I
sign.
should do.
Do it.
So, Sylvia, do you have any pets?
Oh no, I don't have any pets.
No pets.
Sadly, no. My children are my pets right
You're
now.
they're enough work, aren't they? Don't worry.
Oh, they're enough work. But my daughter is a massive fan of animals, and I'm
Oh,
sure that at some point in our lives we are going to get either a cat or a dog. But we don't really want any pets now
yeah.
because children are small and it's enough work. And also, when my daughter will be a bit bigger, when she will grasp what a duty is, then
Yes. Yeah.
then maybe. No,
Yeah.
I'm not saying
Makes
yes.
sense to me.
Maybe.
Makes sense. And if you could give your teenage self a piece of
Mhm.
advice, what
Mhm.
would you say to yourself if you could do that?
I would say believe in yourself. Believe in yourself. That's it.
Yeah. It's simple and it's
Yeah.
good, isn't it? It's always good
Simple.
advice. All right. And the
No.
very last thing, and then I'll let you get on with your day, is the Tudor takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway, so a little suggestion of something for our listeners to explore after the episode. So do you
Mhm.
have a Tudor takeaway for us?
Well, yes, because I live in Slovenia, so I can't always go to the archives when I want to,
Yes.
but it's very nice when these things like manuscripts are digitized. So the British Library, they have this digitized manuscript section on their website, and you have all sorts of things there: illuminated manuscript, prayer books. There are some of the Tudor manuscripts as well. Yeah, there's this Anne Boleyn's prayer book that belonged to her, and I often just leaf through those beautiful illuminated manuscript because, well, first of all, I can do it at home. Second of all, I'm not touching it, so I'm not damaging it.
Yeah.
And it just, gives me this idea of being connected to the past and just, beautiful way of spending your time if you have, spare some minutes. So it's on the British Library's website. So www.bl.uk, and then you go to the catalogs and collections, digital collections.
Yes, and you can spend hours browsing. I warn you, I
Oh
warn
yeah, you
everyone
can
listening, like I've
fall
done
that
before.
into that hole, yes.
Well, I'll put a link to that on our show notes. That's a wonderful suggestion. And Sylvia, it's been so lovely talking to you today. Thank you so much for talking Tudors with us.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for inviting me. It was so much fun.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.